One law from Brussels forced Google, Meta, and Amazon to change everything. Before 2018, companies could collect almost any personal data they wanted. Your location, your health searches, your private messages, all fair game. There were no real consequences for misuse. Then came the General Data Protection Regulation, and the digital world was never the same. The scale of this problem was staggering. By 2017, data breaches exposed over 2.9 billion personal records in a single year. Facebook's Cambridge Analytica scandal revealed that 87 million users had their data harvested without consent. People were outraged, and regulators finally had the political will to act. The GDPR didn't appear overnight. Its roots trace back to the European Convention on Human Rights in 1950, which recognized privacy as a fundamental right. The EU's Data Directive of 1995 laid groundwork, but the Internet had exploded far beyond what that law could handle. The GDPR took 4 years to draft, passed in 2016, and came into force in 2018. So what exactly is the GDPR? At its core, it's a regulation that gives European Union citizens 8 fundamental rights over their personal data. These include the right to know what data is collected, the right to access it, the right to correct it, the right to delete it, the famous right to be forgotten, and the right to say no to data processing altogether. The penalties are what gave the GDPR its teeth. Companies that violate the regulation can be fined up to 4% of their global annual revenue, or 20 million euros, whichever is higher. For a company like Meta, 4% of global revenue means billions of dollars. This wasn't a slap on the wrist. This was an existential financial threat. And those fines are very real. Let's look at the biggest GDPR penalties ever issued. Meta Ireland received a record €1.2 billion fine in 2023 for illegally transferring European user data to the United States. Amazon was fined €746 million in 2021. Google has been hit multiple times, totaling hundreds of millions. These are not symbolic gestures, but here's the truly remarkable thing. The GDPR doesn't just apply to European companies. If your business anywhere in the world processes the data of European Union residents, you must comply. This is called the extraterritorial scope, and it is the reason a startup in San Francisco, a factory in Tokyo, or an e-commerce site in Sydney all had to overhaul their data practices. This global reach has been called the Brussels effect, the phenomenon where European Union regulations effectively become global standards because multinational companies find it easier to apply the strictest rules everywhere rather than maintain separate systems. GDPR didn't just change Europe. It quietly reformed data practices for hundreds of millions of users worldwide. Now let's look at what GDPR actually demands of companies. The regulation requires organizations to have a lawful basis for every single piece of data they collect. There are 6 legal bases in total: consent, contract, legal obligation, vital interests, public task, and legitimate interests. Most consumer tech companies rely on consent, which means your cookie pop-up is legally required, not optional. The compliance cost has been enormous. A 2018 survey found that Fortune 500 companies spent an average of $16 million each preparing for the GDPR. Total estimated compliance costs across US businesses alone exceeded $7.8 billion. For small and medium businesses, the burden was often even heavier proportionally, with fewer resources to hire lawyers and data officers. Some companies didn't just struggle, they simply left Europe. When the GDPR came into force, dozens of US news websites, like the Los Angeles Times, the Chicago Tribune, and many others simply blocked European users entirely rather than face compliance. This reveals something important. The regulation was so demanding that some businesses chose market exit over compliance. Now let's look at the consumer side. For European Union citizens, the GDPR introduced genuine, meaningful protections. You can now demand any company tell you exactly what data they hold about you. You can request deletion. You can object to profiling. In a test by journalists, one person requested their data from Google and received a file of over 5 gigabytes. That's how much one company knew about a single human being. Complaints under GDPR have skyrocketed. Data protection authorities across Europe received over 1,500,000 complaints in just the first 5 years. The most common involve unsolicited marketing emails, cookie consent violations, and data breaches. Crucially, citizens now have a free, official channel to hold corporations accountable, something that simply didn't exist before. Now let's compare this to the United States. The US has no single federal data privacy law equivalent to GDPR. Instead, it has a patchwork of sector-specific rules: HIPAA for health data, COPPA for children's data, GLBA for financial data. But for the average adult's general personal data, there is no comprehensive federal protection. Every state does its own thing. The contrast becomes even starker when you look at China. China's data privacy law, the Personal Information Protection Law, passed in 2021, looks superficially similar to GDPR. It requires consent, limits data collection, and demands transparency. But there's one enormous difference. It applies to private companies, while the state itself has essentially unlimited access to all citizen data. Privacy from corporations? Yes. Privacy from the government? Absolutely not. The advertising industry was among the hardest hit by GDPR. The old model of ad tech relied on third-party cookies, tiny trackers that followed you across every website you visited, building a detailed profile of your interests, politics, health, and income. GDPR essentially outlawed this without explicit consent. Google announced it would phase out third-party cookies entirely. The programmatic advertising market, worth over $400 billion, had to fundamentally reinvent itself. Big tech adapted, but not always in good faith. Researchers discovered that many companies use dark patterns in their cookie consent systems. A dark pattern is a deceptive user interface design that tricks people into agreeing to data collection. The Accept All button was huge and bright. The Decline or Customize option was tiny, grey, and required 7 clicks. France's data regulator fined Google and Facebook a combined €210 million specifically for manipulative cookie consent designs. Let's look at a critical case study, the Meta Island ruling of 2023. Meta had been routing all European user data to servers in the United States under a legal framework called Standard Contractual Clauses. The Irish Data Protection Commission ruled this was illegal, because US surveillance law, particularly Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, meant US intelligence agencies could access that data without European legal oversight. One of the biggest criticisms of GDPR is that it has paradoxically entrenched big tech dominance. Here's the irony. A law designed to protect consumers from data exploitation may have actually helped Google and Meta by raising compliance barriers so high that smaller competitors couldn't afford them. Studies showed that after GDPR, Google's share of digital ad revenue in Europe actually increased, as smaller ad tech players were forced out. Another challenge is enforcement inconsistency. The GDPR is enforced by national data protection authorities. and they don't all move at the same speed. Ireland's Data Protection Commission became infamous for slow enforcement because most US tech giants have their EU headquarters in Dublin. Critics called Ireland a safe haven. The Irish regulator issued only 3 fines in its first 2 years, while handling over 160 open investigations into major tech companies. Now let's talk about the data economy more broadly. GDPR sits at the centre of a massive global power struggle over who gets to profit from personal data. Data has been called the new oil, and just like oil, whoever controls it gains enormous economic and political power. The EU's bet with GDPR was that strong individual rights could rebalance that power. Early results suggest it's working, but slowly. The GDPR also gave rise to an entirely new profession, the Data Protection Officer, or DPO. Under the regulation, any organisation that processes data on a large scale must appoint a DPO to oversee compliance. This created an estimated 500,000 new roles globally. Privacy engineering, privacy law, and data governance are now among the fastest growing career fields in the technology sector. What do EU citizens themselves think? Surveys consistently show overwhelming public support for GDPR. A Eurobarometer survey found that 71% of EU residents are aware of GDPR. 67% say it gives them confidence their data is protected. 36% have actively exercised their rights, requesting data, filing complaints, or opting out. The law is not just popular in theory, people are using it. So is GDPR actually working as intended? The honest answer is, partly. Fines are being issued, rights are being exercised. Some of the most egregious data practices have been curtailed. But enforcement is still too slow. Dark patterns persist, and some of the biggest violators, particularly in AI training data, remain largely unchecked. The regulation is a floor, not a ceiling, and some regulators haven't even reached the floor yet. Looking ahead, the next frontier is artificial intelligence. The EU AI Act, passed in 2024, is GDPR's spiritual successor, applying similar rights-based logic to AI systems. Meanwhile, the US continues to resist a federal privacy law, caught between tech industry lobbying and state-level fragmentation. China is tightening its corporate data rules while loosening state surveillance. The next decade will determine whether privacy becomes a universal right or a privilege for Europeans only. The GDPR is imperfect, contentious, and sometimes maddening, but it represents something genuinely rare in the history of technology: a powerful, rights-based counterweight to unchecked corporate data extraction. Whether you find it liberating or infuriating probably depends on which side of the fence you're on. For businesses, it's a compliance burden. For citizens, it's the closest thing to a digital Bill of Rights the world has ever seen. The question now is whether the rest of the world will follow, or whether data privacy will remain a privilege of geography. Data is not just a product, it is a mirror of who you are, your habits, your fears, your relationships, your politics. How that mirror is controlled, and by whom, may be one of the defining questions of the 21st century. GDPR didn't answer that question, but it forced the world to start asking it.